All right, in this video, we'll be looking at some different theories concerning taxonomy, basically just broadening our concept of cladistics that we learned in the last video. There are some common terms that are associated that we'll use as we talk about this. One of them is monophyly or a monophyletic group. And a monophyletic group includes the most recent common ancestor and all of its descendants. This is basically the same thing as a clade. So you pick an ancestor and all of its descendants, and you have a monophyletic group. You could circle this entire thing and call it a monophyletic group. Or you could circle J, K, and I over here and call it a monophyletic group. The idea is you find the ancestor and you circle all of it and its descendants, and that becomes a clade. And you can study just a clade, or you can go back further and look at a different clade. So like this class, we're looking at all animals. That is a particular clade, but we're also going to look at closer and more specific monophyletic groups as we go through the class. Another example is Paraphyly, and a paraphyletic group contains the most recent common ancestor and all of its members, but can exclude other members of that. And so a paraphyletic group may go all the way back to, say, this class may go all the way back to the first animals, but only look at one group of animals in that. And so taking it all the way back. And then, so this would be, you're making this choice deliberately in order to group things. So this may be if you just want to study a particular section, but also want to take it back to its ancestry and leave this section out. Be something there. And a polyphyletic group is a group that does not contain the most recent common ancestor. The group could have two completely separate origins. So if you circle E and G here, there's no way of knowing where they came from. It's not considering their origins, and so this is typically try to avoid this in the study of evolutionary taxonomy, which evolutionary taxonomy is. So the idea here is that you're going to retain the basic ideas of classification when it comes to just basic Linnaeus structures, but you're going to group these hierarchies based on complexity and even particular traits of complexity. So you can kind of see here how they've done this. It almost makes it seem like that as you get further up and further to the right, things become more and more complex because there are particular things that happened, let's say here, that cause this group to kind of branch off and become their own thing. And we know that from history, right? This is what would be like a great extinction events at different points and cause some groups to do well and cause some groups not to do so well. And so we have a couple of terms for this. One of those terms is adaptive zone. An adaptive zone is think about the relationship between the species and the environment. That as the environment changes, you're going to have that species is going to change with it, and there's going to be certain pressures on that species to change, or it's going to die. And so think of it as a mutual relationship between the environment and the organism. Now, what this is going to cause, let's take birds, for instance. Birds have a particular adaptive zone, right? The presence of trees, the presence of predators on the ground, and so there's a particular adaptive zone. Flying becomes a good thing. Well, we know that not all birds fly. There are certain pressures that may have led to certain groups not showing all of the ancestral traits, and so what we do is we call this a grade. A grade is a taxon that constitutes a particular adaptive zone. So birds are all over the world, but there's only one kind of bird that made it into the Arctic, and there are certain adaptations that are in the Antarctic, and there's certain kind of adaptations that it did for that, right? It swims instead of flies, its wings are adopted, its feathers are changed, and so there are certain things that make it very particular. And so a grade is a species that doesn't necessarily look like the rest of the organisms in its taxon, and so in some ways has become more complex, or a higher evolutionary level, if you want to look at it like this. When you're talking about adaptive zones, they could be monophyletic groups or paraphyletic groups, but we'll typically try to avoid polyphyletic groups. And so this brings us to this idea of phylogenetic systematics. Basically, another name for cladistics, emphasizes the criteria of common descent. As we go through all the different phyla in this class, we're going to emphasize those characteristics of common descent, and we're going to look at different categories like this. We're always going to go back to that ancestral group and look at the ancestors from that. So we're going to try to avoid if we're even going to try to avoid paraphyly, we're going to mainly be doing monophyletic groups. And this could lead to another concept, which is the concept of sister groups, where you have two monophyletic taxa that have a recent common ancestor. Like you could take primates, for instance, or you could even look at humans and chimps, as we show a recent common ancestor, and oftentimes they're considered a sister group in that way.